Hello, and welcome to this edition of People in Transition. I'm your host, Bob Gerst. I've been hiring, firing, and mentoring executives, frontline employees, interns, and job seekers in companies around the world through a host of transitions, some difficult, but most very good. I work with people in Hong Kong, India, Australia, and across the United States. What sets them apart? A lot, but there's more they have in common. And one of those commonalities is transition is a part of life. This experience has given me a bird's eye view on a variety of trends, economies, industry disruptors, and transitions that are big and small. It also brought me into contact with the thought leaders and decision makers you need to meet, the people who can make the difference that matters to you right now. Imagine knowing exactly what to do next and how to know it's time to make your big change. The insight track you're going to access during our future episodes is better than a crystal ball. It's the exact information you need to take that next step. Whether you're a new grad applying for your first professional job, someone looking to transition your work experience into a promotion, launching your own company, or maybe even starting to plan your retirement, you're in transition, and this series is for you. We all know transition can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And it's even fun when you have VIP access to the future you want. Are you tired of the uncertainty of being passed up? We'll share with you the tools and skills that can take your dreams to the front of the line. So, if change is on your horizon, or maybe just the thought of change, you won't want to miss this discussion. It could be the exact edge you need to turn transition into an amazing opportunity. Mac Prichard, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of People in Transition. I'm really excited about this opportunity.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Bob.
Mac, when you were younger, what did you want to be when you, and I'm using air quotes here, grew up?
When I was in grade school, I saw a movie called The Candidate. It starred Robert Redford in it. If you're older than 50, you probably remember who he is. It was about a fellow in this movie who was running for statewide office in California. And it came out just before the 1972 election. And I love that movie so much. It shows an election campaign unfolding and what happens all the way through election day that I sat through that picture twice, Bob. And I thought, I want to do that one day, maybe run for office, but definitely work on a political campaign. And I tell you that story because many years later, when I was 30, I enrolled in graduate school in Boston. And I took a class called To Be a Politician. And our homework for the first weekend was to watch that movie. And I thought, I'm in the right place.
You got extra credit because you watched it 3 times, I take it. So
I did, yeah.
And did you become a candidate or did you help someone run for an office?
I did. When I got out of the University of Iowa, I wanted to do 3 things, and I probably couldn't have said it as concisely as this, but on my list, we're working on an election campaign. Second was to get paid to write for a living, and the third was to do human rights advocacy in Latin America. And I've done all 3 of those things. My first job after college was working on a U.S. Senate race. And since then, I've worked as a paid staffer on several congressional races. I've worked as a volunteer on several presidential campaigns, either doing grassroots organizing or raising money. And I've worked for elected officials. I was a speechwriter for a governor of Oregon. I was a city hall communications director for a mayoral candidate in Portland, where I'm speaking from. And when I lived in Boston, I even worked for Kennedy. I worked for Joe Kennedy when he first ran for Congress way back in the 1980s. Not the Joe Kennedy who recently gave up the office, but his father.
Mac, throughout that time, from that early childhood to where you're at today, you personally have gone through a number of transitions. Why don't you describe some of those transitions that got you to where you're at today?
I've had a lot of different jobs, and I've been in the workplace now, Bob, for 40 plus years. But there's a constant that runs through the different positions. I've looked for jobs that allowed me to make a difference about issues I cared about, or to make a difference in the community where I lived and worked. So after that first campaign, after my college graduation, I went east and I lived on the East Coast for 11 years. I'd, again, grown up in Iowa. And my first two jobs were working for human rights organizations that were involved in Latin American policy. And those opportunities gave me the chance to develop my writing and public relations skills. I learned how to work with reporters, write news releases, edit a publication. And I also learned some basic management skills. And those positions led to eventually a job in Boston where I was working doing communications, first for a big public works project and then for a state government agency. And I made a switch after graduate school in Boston to come to the West Coast. And my career here in Oregon for many years was working in communications for nonprofits, elected officials, and government agencies. And I made a big switch again about 13 years ago when I started my own public relations company. And I also started a second company 10 years ago, a regional job board called maxlist.org. And we share job listings and lots of content about how to get good at job search as a skill, and for employers about how to get better at hiring. Many of our customers are small organizations. Hiring is not a frequent event, and the people who are often put in charge of it haven't been trained in it. So our mission at MaxList is to make hiring more human. So I tell you about all those different positions because, again, there is a constant that runs through them, and there is a consistent story that can be told about them. And I think all of us are going to have similar journeys. And if we reflect back on what we've done and why, we can all tell equally consistent stories about those journeys.
So, Mac, you talk about, as you were making decisions, you talk about kind of values, communication, things that were important to you as an individual, which really comes down to what is the culture of that company. And if I'm a job seeker and I'm looking for a culture, like maybe a more laid back one or a more entrepreneurial one or a more hard charging one or whatever that culture is that you're looking for, how would you coach me as a job seeker to find out what that company culture is, what it's really like? And what if the culture does not fit what you're looking for, but everything else about the job is right? What should I do?
You should start by being clear about your own values, both personally and professionally, and take a moment to not only reflect on them, but write them down and talk to people who know you well and just do a reality check, whether it's with family or friends. And then to find out if a company is a good culture fit, you can do basic research, look online, check out websites, check Glassdoor reviews. But Bob, there's no substitute for talking to people. So you want to find people who work inside that company or who worked there once and ask them about their experiences and ask them about the culture fit, or the culture rather. And as you do that, if it's not a good culture fit based on what you've defined as important to you, then it probably isn't going to work. What you want to do is find the kind of company that offers the culture that you want.
Mac, let's start back kind of at the beginning of the process. Let's say that, especially in these times, you have a friend that contacts you and they have just found out that they've lost their job because the company is going out of business because of the COVID crisis. What's the one or two or three things that you would tell that person to do right now?
Well, if you haven't done so, take some time for yourself and take some time just to mourn and acknowledge that you're going through a big transition. The other thing I would tell you to do is invest time in being clear about what you want to do next. Often when people are laid off, especially unexpectedly, I understand the reasoning behind this impulse, but they sit down on Monday and they start grinding out resumes and sending out applications. And I understand this because I did it myself, Bob. I've had a very enjoyable career, but like any career, I've had my ups and downs, and I've had 2 long periods of unemployment. So I know what it's like to cash that last unemployment check. And I know what it's like to sit down on Monday morning and think that success means sending out 5, 10, 15 resumes. Instead, what I would tell someone is get clear about your goals and invest the time to do that. Not only know what job do you want, but then invest time in identifying the organizations, whether it's private companies, nonprofits, public agencies, where you want to work. You got to know what you want and where you want to go. Because when you can answer those questions, Bob, whether you've been laid off unexpectedly or you're getting ready to do a job search from a position that you have and you're not ready to leave yet, then you can invest time in building relationships inside the organizations where you want to work and find out what the needs of those employers are and find out about that company culture. Because I know you know this, and I know many of your listeners do too, referrals and word of mouth are so powerful in hiring. And sometimes when people hear what a difference that makes, they think, well, I'm doomed. I don't know anybody. Well, first of all, we all have networks. And second, if you can understand how the system works, then you can make the system work for you. So your challenge is be clear about what you want, know where you want to go, and start building networks inside those organizations so you can get those referrals and hear about those positions that aren't going to be advertised and have your name come up when a position does open up. So when there's 25, 30, 50 resumes in a stack, somebody comes down the hall and says, hey, you should talk to Bob. I had coffee with him a month ago. I think he's great. And then you'll be one of the 5 or 10 people that get an interview. That won't get you the job, but it'll get you in the door, and then you have an opportunity to sell yourself.
Mac, any other techniques, tips that you would give our listeners to help your resume stand out in that stack? You talked about the networking. Is there anything else that you would suggest that they do with their resume to help in that process?
2 things. One, talk about accomplishments, not responsibilities. And this sounds very obvious, but it's remarkable how many resumes read like position descriptions. And what employers are looking for are problem solvers. There's always something that's keeping a hiring manager up at night, and they're looking for people who have solved problems and produced results, and your resume offers you an opportunity to show that. And the second thing I would say is tweak your resume for every application. And don't send out the same resume for every job. And how do you tweak it? Well, you're going to spend 15, 30, 45 minutes studying the job posting, maybe making a phone call or two, or swapping emails with somebody who knows something about the challenges of that company. And you can make some very simple changes that will show that you have some insight into what that employer needs, and that's going to make your resume stand out.
You've mentioned networking a couple of times already. In order to accelerate your search, you need to get comfortable with engaging your own personal network as well as new contacts. But what happens if networking makes you very uncomfortable? Again, whether it's people you know or new people, what do I do to overcome that?
Well, 2 things, Bob. The first is, I think, invest time in learning how to network effectively. Many people don't understand how to do it, but they try, and they think it means meeting someone for a coffee or asking to pick someone's brain. And I've done those things, so I say this respectfully. That's not going to work. When you're asking to meet someone to network about your job search, it's a business meeting. You're in charge, and just like any business meeting, you got to walk into the room with an agenda. And a good networking meeting, when you're doing a job search, accomplishes 3 goals. It allows you to introduce yourself, share your story. The second thing it allows you to do is ask some strategic questions about your search. What companies might be hiring, who might be growing, who are key players in the industry, those sorts of things. And the third thing that you can accomplish in a good networking meeting is asking for introductions to other leaders in the field, because again, you're growing a network. And if you know what your job search goal is and the companies you want to work for, if you've made a list of 20, 25, you can do this in a strategic way, and you might end up having several dozen, maybe even 50 conversations over the course of 6 months. But you're going to find out about positions that aren't advertised, and you're going to tap into that power of referral. So learn how to do it. There are lots of good books. University career centers have good people who can help you, state employment offices. You can work with a career coach. The second thing I would say is people are often shy and think that networking means glad handing and backslapping. Networking is about relationships. And so play to your strength. If you're someone who isn't comfortable in big crowds or with public speaking, think about what you are comfortable with. If you're an introvert, maybe you volunteer to staff the registration desk at the local chapter of your industry association. That's a great way to meet people. Or maybe you like taking pictures. You're a photographer. Maybe you volunteer to take the pictures for the next monthly lunch meeting of your professional chapter. That's also a great way of meeting people. And it doesn't have to be all about one-on-one meetings or going to events. Sometimes you can work with, networking can also mean volunteering and doing something you really enjoy. And if you do that in your field, you're going to meet leaders and influencers who are, again, you can build a professional relationship with, who can give you leads and insights for your job search.
Sometimes, even in today's world, organizations don't have effective talent management systems. They don't do a good job, let's say, on performance reviews. And so other than your very offhanded or unstructured feedback, it may have been a while since you've actually received any feedback. And now you're out in the job market. How do I find out kind of where my strengths and weaknesses are so that I can be aware of them and talk to them if I need to in the interviewing process?
There are many off-the-shelf self-assessment tools you can use, like Strength Finders, Myers-Briggs, but I don't think there's any substitute, Bob, for talking with people who know you well. So getting in touch with former colleagues and supervisors, classmates, former professors, and ask a few targeted questions about what you're good at, what people think are your strengths, what they saw you accomplish when you worked together. I'm a big believer in having a kind of a brag folder, so I would encourage you to do this throughout your career. When you get notes from customers or thank you cards, people you've met with or talked with or worked with, or your annual reviews, keep them in that folder and hold on to that throughout your career, because when it comes time to update your resume, refresh your LinkedIn page, or ask people for endorsements and testimonials on LinkedIn or to serve as references, that's a great source to have.
Mac, many of today's first interviews are done over the telephone, maybe over Zoom, which is a really different dynamic than doing it in person. How do you make a telephone screening interview more successful for you?
There are a number of steps you can take. One is, if the phone rings and it's a recruiter who says, "Can I talk to you now?" If you haven't had a chance to prepare, it's okay to say, "I'm actually doing something. I wonder if we could talk later in the day or set a time to speak tomorrow." And that gives you a chance to research the company, maybe do some additional homework. It's also appropriate to ask if you can see the questions in advance, even for that initial screener. Usually the questions are pretty basic, but often the recruiter will share them with you. And then I think it's also important to, having done the homework and ask for questions in advance, as with any interview, you want to practice in general. So if you haven't done a job search in some time, you should do some role playing with a trusted friend or colleague, and do it over the phone, do it over Zoom, and then record yourself and listen to yourself. It's painful. I've done it, but that's how you get better. Again, it's it's one of the most important business meetings you'll have in the course of the year. If you were making an important presentation, you would practice it. So why wouldn't you practice an interview, whether it's over the phone or in person or via Zoom?
How do you think recruiters or hiring managers react when they hear that you've been laid off? And kind of a follow-up question to that, I guess, is there a way that you should manage informing them about the layoff that you experienced?
I think it's important to provide an explanation, because if you remain silent, the people you meet with may make up their own story. So tell your story. Now, the circumstances can vary. It's not uncommon to be at a company and if you were part of a team or a large number of people that were laid off, talk about it in a matter-of-fact way. I was working at the Acme Corporation because of the pandemic or the recession. The company was forced to let X number of people go. I was one of that group of 50, 75, 100, and I was disappointed to be chosen, but now I'm focusing on my job search, and I'm grateful for the time I had with the organization. And you just want to provide the explanation, make it simple, make it matter of fact, and then talk about the future, why you're excited about this opportunity, and why you're interested in working with this company. And then you've provided that explanation, and you haven't let the interviewers make up a story of their own.
What if you have something bad in your past work history, discipline, maybe even fired? How do you handle that with a potential new employer?
I think you should expect that the person you're interviewing with, if they're about to make an offer, is going to contact your last employer. And then I think you need to reflect on the circumstances you left, under which you left. Now, some employers may have a practice of saying, well, all I can do is confirm that so-and-so worked here. And if you know that's the practice, I think that leads to one kind of explanation. If the former supervisor who fired you is going to go into some detail about what happened, I think you have to prepare for that as well. So that's the first question I would ask. Let's go to the worst case scenario, Bob. There's going to be a chatty supervisor who's going to describe some reasons why you were dismissed. You've got to do two things. One is you got to take the initiative, and I don't think you want to do this in the first interview, but maybe in the third, when you're one of perhaps two finalists, you want to bring this up and say, well, I expect you'll be checking references soon, and I do want to talk about my departure from the company, and I want you to know that this is what happened. I was dismissed, and what I learned from this experience was this, and if I'm in a situation like that again, these are the steps I would take. But I want you to be aware of this, and I also encourage you to check my other references, and it's helpful if you have a list available of people who also worked with you at that organization and saw your strengths and can speak to those as well. And I think, again, what matters here is that you understand what the employer is likely to hear. Second, that you take the initiative and you have a plan. And I think that you need allies inside the organization, and it's likely you have them, whether former colleagues or people still working there, who can not discuss the circumstances of your departure, but talk about your strengths.
So, Mac, what does taking care of your personal brand mean, and how can you improve on that personal brand?
The way we show ourselves to the world, especially online, makes a huge difference in our career. So the digital footprint we create especially matters a lot to employers. Hiring managers, recruiters, employers, they all Google potential candidates. You want to make sure you put your best foot forward when you're posting on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and other platforms. And if you are talking about professional matters and industry events, that's going to help you as a candidate. You need to pay attention to that, and it is a big part of your personal brand. But it's not only your digital presence, Bob, it's what you're doing in the community and what you're doing with your colleagues. Are you volunteering? Are you showing up at events? Are you making time to talk to colleagues who are doing job searches. It's all of those things, and you're creating a reputation, and that reputation is really vital to the success of your career.
Mac, going through a transition can be stressful. And as we all know, stress can have an impact in our health. How does your health and your well-being impact your success of transition? And how would you suggest someone take care of that to maximize their results?
Health matters so much, not only in a transition, but throughout our lives and in our careers. So you got to take care of yourself. I would say to people who are doing a job search, especially if they've recently been laid off, there's a impulse to just put in as much effort as possible. And you really shouldn't work on a job search during the course of a week more than, say, 30 hours, 40 max. I know it's common to hear, well, a job search is a job, and it is, but you're going to see diminishing results after 35, 40 hours. Some people think they just got to sit in front of the computer all day and grind out resumes, and that's going to hurt them. You also need to pay attention to friendships and family relationships and exercise and diet, especially during a transition, because if your energy is down, if you're discouraged, if you're not connecting with friends and family, that's going to show up in the interview, and it's going to harm your chances as a candidate.
Mac, you said that you had been unemployed sometimes for a longer period of time. How did you deal with the stress of being unemployed, looking for a job, keeping your energy and emotions up?
It was hard. The first time was in my mid-20s, and I'd had 3 great jobs in a row, Bob. I got that job on a U.S. Senate campaign after college through a newspaper ad. Then I went to D.C. I was working for a national human rights organization, talking to the New York Times. I was like 22. And I got that through an internship. And then I had this wonderful job in Boston. We took members of Congress on fact-finding trips to Central America. This was way back in the 1980s, and I was 25, and I got that just through a referral. So I left that third job, and I thought I'd have no trouble getting my next position. Boy, was I wrong. I had 2 challenges. One was I didn't know what I wanted to do. I kept applying for all these different kinds of jobs. I was open to everything, and I would get interviews, but I would never got an offer because the employers could tell I was uncertain about my goal. So I tell you all that because I was out of work for 7 months. I did cash the last unemployment check. And what kept me going in the end were a couple of things. One, I did volunteer, and I worked on a congressional race for Joe Kennedy, and I ghost wrote these things for him and helped with his issues team and his grassroots campaigns, and that kept me in contact with professionals in my field, and I got a lot of energy from that. So volunteering is really important. And when the campaign ended, I was still looking, and my unemployment had run out, and I took a job as an office temporary. And there's a dignity that comes with work. I was doing office work, filing and copying, but it wasn't very exciting, especially compared to what I'd been doing. But it got me out of the house, it paid my bills, and it just kind of got me out of my head. So those 2 things, volunteering in my field and then taking a part-time office job, I set aside 2 days for job search and 3 days for office work, made a huge, huge difference.
Even people who are still employed are dealing with transitions in these times. Less people around to do more work, sometimes new assignments, the fear of the unknown. Work looks different today than it did just 12 short months ago. Any suggestions for those people who are employed but going through their own transition, how to cope with the huge changes that have taken place in today's workplace?
It's tough because we don't know how much longer it will go on. It won't go on forever, but there's uncertainty about when the pandemic will end. In the meantime, we're all in our homes, those of us who are working from home, and those who aren't, who are going out to factories or other workplaces. You have to deal with the risk to your health, and that brings an additional stress that is even more burdensome. So I think that the ways to cope are paying attention to friendships and family, reaching out to people. If you're working at home, set boundaries. Work an 8-hour day. If you can, not everybody can do this. You might be working from your dining room table, but if you can set up a workstation in a part of the house with a door and you can close it, setting those kinds of boundaries can make a huge difference. Otherwise, you can just work all day, and we've all heard that a variation of that line, every day is Tuesday in pandemic time, and you find yourself working Saturdays and Sundays. So set boundaries, pay attention to relationships, and take care of yourself.
Mac, any books or other resources that you would recommend to our listeners for someone who is going through a transition?
3 books come to mind. One of my favorites, it's a classic, is Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. And he had a column for a number of years with, I think, Inc. magazine, but it's a great guide to networking and doing it in a way that is of service to others, because good networkers don't only ask for help, they also give to others, and they give without expectation of getting anything in return. The second book I really like is called The 20-Minute Networking Meeting by Nathan Perez. He's an HR expert in Minnesota. You can find both of these books on Amazon. But what I like about Nathan's book, you can read it in a couple of hours. He takes you through what a good informational interview looks like and what a bad one looks like. It's very practical. And I think for people who are struggling with setting up meetings and are not sure how to do it, it's an excellent book. I also have a book called Land Your Dream Job Anywhere. Again, I run a regional job board and career hub called maxlist.org. And one of the things that distinguishes us from other great career sites out there is we provide lots and lots of practical information about job search and about hiring. And this book distills our best advice about job search skills. And I'll tell you, I run a job board. I'm very proud of the value it offers. I meet people all the time who tell me they're spending 100% of their job search time on sites like mine, and I'm grateful for their attention. But I'll be the first to tell you, Bob, you got to step away from the computer. And if you're spending more than 30% of your time looking for job listings, you're making your job search a lot harder than it has to be, because in the end, referrals, networking, talking to people, those are among the most effective ways to get your next job.
Mac, as we wrap up here, if our listeners only remember 3 things as they go through their personal transition, what are those 3 things you want them to take with them from today?
Know the job you want. You can't say I'm open to anything or I'm exploring. You got to be specific. And if you're not sure, pick the top 3 kinds of positions that interest you, then tell people that. Because when you do that, Bob, what happens is the person listening to you says, oh, I know somebody who does that, or have you talked to so-and-so? It's number 2, you got to know where you want to go. You got to make a list of 15, 20, your top 25 organizations where you'd like to work. And I find when I talk to people and I press them, they've usually got 3, 5, 6 in their head, and that's a good start. You write it down, but then grow the list. And that means doing homework and talking to people. But what happens when you do that is then you're creating a map, and you're figuring out where you want to go and who you need to talk to inside those organizations to find out about upcoming opportunities, particularly those that may never get advertised. And number 3 is talk to others. Again, I mentioned this earlier. If you're spending all day in front of the computer, you're making it's so much harder than it has to be. Recognize that many jobs get filled through word of mouth, through referrals, and tap into that system. Make the system work for you, and go out and tell people where you want to go, what you want to do, and you will find that the doors will open and you'll get your job much sooner and easier and faster than if you rely on computers alone.
Mac Prichard, thank you so much for your caring enough to share with our listeners your experiences, your thoughts. I know that I've been doing this 40 some years, and I took several notes from things that you talked about. So it is of great value to people who are in the midst or soon will be in the midst of going through their own transition. So Mac, thank you. We appreciate your being with us today.
You're welcome. And I invite people to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you do, please tell me that you heard me on this show. And I also host a weekly podcast. It's called Find Your Dream Job. And every week I talk to a different career expert about the nuts and bolts of job hunting. And you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts.
And I've listened to that, and it was one of the reasons why I started this podcast. So Mac, you're a leader in many ways. I appreciate it. Good talking with you. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We're working in unprecedented times as the world responds to the recent COVID-19 crisis. The fact is that even those who are not in transition understand it could be right around the corner, next month or a year from now. The purpose of these episodes are to give listeners support and the critical tools to adjust with the winds, wherever they come. I'll continue to introduce you to guests who have successfully, perhaps gracefully or without too many battle scars, survived their own obstacle courses, and can share useful information on how to steady your ship or your world in this uncertainty. If today's message was helpful to you, please share it on social media. If you have any questions or podcast ideas for future conversations, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I appreciate your time you're investing in sharing these important conversations with me, my guests, and others who are going through life transition. Transitions between jobs, life stages, new entrepreneurial ventures, or whatever life brings. Change is constant. The more prepared you are for it, the better and easier the change will occur. Thank you again. This is your host, Bob Gerst. See you at our next episode of People in Transition.